I was 53 years old before I realized my mother had lied to me my entire life. Not about money, not about love, about something much smaller and somehow much more painful. Growing up, everyone in our family knew one thing. My older sister, Rebecca, was Mom's favorite. She got the new dresses, the first slice of birthday cake, the front seat in the car. When she made mistakes, Mom called them accidents. When I made the same mistakes, they became lessons. After a while, I stopped wondering why. I simply learned my place. I told myself it didn't matter anymore, that grown women don't keep score of who got the bigger slice of cake. But somewhere underneath all that pretending, a little girl was still counting. For more than 50 years, I believed that story, until the afternoon after Mom's funeral. While cleaning out an old cedar chest in her bedroom, I found a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front, not Rebecca's, mine. Inside was a letter that completely changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The envelope. The day after my mother's funeral, the house felt strangely unfamiliar. For 36 years, my parents had lived in that white farmhouse outside Columbus, Ohio. Dad's recliner still faced the television he'd watched every evening. Mom's knitting basket sat beside the fireplace exactly where she'd left it. Nothing had moved, except the person who had held the whole house together. Rebecca arrived just after 9 that morning, carrying coffee for both of us. "We should probably start with the closets," she said. Practical, efficient, that was Rebecca. Even grief seemed organized around her. For hours we worked in near silence. Old winter coats, boxes of Christmas decorations, Dad's fishing gear. Every item carried a memory. Every memory carried another goodbye. Around lunchtime, her husband called. Their youngest grandson had a fever. "I need to head back," she said apologetically. "You sure you'll be okay here?" I smiled. "I'll lock up when I'm finished." Standing alone in that quiet house, I realized something. For the first time in my life, there wasn't anyone left to compare me to my sister. No Mom, no Dad, no family dinners where Rebecca naturally became the center of every conversation, just me, and an empty house. The grandfather clock chimed 3 times in the hallway below. Dad used to say that clock kept better time than any of us. I stood at the top of the stairs and listened until the last chime faded. Then I made myself keep moving. Grief doesn't wait politely for you to be ready. I wandered upstairs without any real purpose. Mom's bedroom still smelled faintly of lavender. On top of her dresser sat the same silver hairbrush she'd used every morning. I picked it up. For reasons I still can't explain, I started crying. Not because of the brush, because I suddenly understood there would never be another ordinary Tuesday phone call. Never another birthday card signed love. Mom, grief has a strange way of arriving. It doesn't always come during funerals. Sometimes it finds you while holding an old hairbrush in an empty bedroom. I wiped my eyes and kept sorting through her things. That's when I noticed the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. As children, Rebecca and I had always been told not to touch it. "Just old family papers," she'd say. I lifted the heavy lid. The hinges groaned like they hadn't been touched in years. Inside were neatly folded quilts, photo albums, yellowed recipes, and small bundles of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Most were addressed to my father. Some were birthday cards from relatives who had passed away before I even started school. I sat on the floor beside the chest and went through them slowly, one by one, in no particular hurry. For a little while it almost felt like visiting her again. Then, underneath everything else, I saw a single cream-colored envelope. It wasn't old. It wasn't tied with ribbon. It looked deliberately placed. Across the front, in my mother's careful handwriting, were just 2 words: "For Hannah." I stared at it for a long time, because in all my years, my mother had never written me a letter. "My dearest Hannah." I actually looked toward the bedroom door before I opened it, as if someone might walk in and tell me not to. My mother had been gone less than 24 hours. Yet somewhere inside me I was still asking permission. I slid my finger beneath the flap. The seal had gone brittle with age. Inside were 2 sheets of paper, 1 letter, and something tucked behind it. I didn't look at the second item yet. My hands were already trembling enough. I unfolded the letter. At the top, in the same handwriting I'd seen on grocery lists and family recipes for decades, were 5 words I never expected to read. "My dearest Hannah." I stopped breathing for a moment. Mom had never spoken to me that way. Not once in 53 years. Rebecca had always been sweetheart, honey, my beautiful girl. I was usually just Hannah, but never my dearest. I swallowed the lump in my throat and kept reading. If you are holding this letter, then I am no longer here to explain the choices I made. For that, I am deeply sorry. There is something you have believed your entire life that is not true. You believed I loved your sister more than I loved you. You deserved an explanation. Instead, I gave you silence. That sentence hurt more than I wanted to admit because it was true. I had spent decades pretending the favoritism didn't bother me. But every little girl notices who gets hugged first, who gets defended, who gets forgiven. I remembered my 10th birthday. Dad had bought me a bicycle, blue with white tires. Before I even rode it, Rebecca asked to try it first. Mom smiled and handed it to her. It's only fair. Your sister is older. It seems so small at the time. But memories like that stack themselves quietly year after year until they become the story you tell yourself about your own worth. The letter continued. Every cold word, every unfair comparison, every moment you believed I loved you less was something I allowed to happen. Not because you deserved it. Because I believed it was the only way to protect you. Protect me. I whispered the words aloud. Protect me from what? I turned the page. The truth began long before either of you were born. Long before your father and I ever lived in this house. There was another family, another promise, another mistake, another family. What did that even mean? The photograph you are holding was taken before you became our daughter. You were not born into our family. You came into it through heartbreak. For several seconds I simply stared. I wasn't breathing. I wasn't blinking. I'd spent my whole life believing I wasn't loved enough. Never once had I questioned whether I belonged. Now, for the very first time, I did. I finally looked at the second item tucked behind the letter. It was an old photograph, edges faded with time. 3 people stood smiling outside a small church. A young man, a young woman, and between them a little girl no older than 4. The man wasn't my father. The woman wasn't my mother, but the little girl looked exactly like me. I turned the photograph over. My mother's handwriting covered the back, one sentence. This was the day everything changed. We loved you from the first day we held you. That part was never a lie. Everything else became more complicated because of my fear. I believed that if I loved you too openly, someone might come looking for you. Come looking for me. Who? I sat there a long time with that single word. Who? It felt like the letter had opened a door into a house I never knew existed inside my own life. Every hallway of it led somewhere unfamiliar. The girl in the photograph. I read the letter again, searching for the answer. The people in that photograph loved you with all their hearts. Circumstances stole you from the life they had imagined. Not from lack of love. Never mistake tragedy for abandonment. Tucked beneath the photograph was a small folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline was still readable. Local couple killed in highway collision. A husband and wife had died instantly after a truck crossed the center line during heavy rain. Their 4-year-old daughter survived with only minor injuries. The child had been placed into emergency care while relatives were located. 4 years old. The same age as the little girl in the picture. I read the small print twice, then a third time, as if repetition might soften it. A grainy photograph accompanied the article, a wrecked car pulled from a ditch. An ambulance in the background, its lights blurred by rain. I forced myself to keep reading. The article ended with a line that made my heart pound harder than anything else. Authorities are continuing to search for surviving family members willing to assume guardianship of the child. I grabbed the letter again. There was a knock at the front door. I nearly jumped. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Collins, holding a covered casserole dish. I thought you might not feel like cooking tonight. She squeezed my hand, then paused. You know, your mother talked about you more than you realized. Whenever she worried, it was always about you, not Rebecca, I asked. She looked surprised by the question. No, it was almost always you. I stood in the doorway long after she drove away. Her words echoed inside my head. It was almost always you. That wasn't the mother I remembered, or was it? How much of our lives had happened behind closed doors, conversations I never heard, worries I never saw. The casserole sat forgotten on the counter while I climbed the stairs again. I hurried back upstairs and kept reading. Your father wanted to tell you when you turned 18. I asked him to wait. Then I asked him to wait again. Until 1 year became 10, and 10 became 20. Eventually, the silence became easier than the truth. I remembered Dad's quiet nature, The way he would start a sentence and stop halfway through as though he'd changed his mind. There had been moments when he looked at me with a sadness I never understood. I always assumed he felt guilty for the way Mom treated me. Now I wasn't sure what that sadness had really meant. His closest friend knew everything, the letter said. His name was Daniel Mercer. If Daniel is still alive, you deserve to hear the story from someone who stood beside us, not from my guilty memory alone. Inside the envelope was a small, faded business card. Daniel Mercer, Mercer Hardware, Lancaster, Ohio. Someone had written a phone number in blue ink beneath the address years after the card was made. I stared at the number. Did it still belong to him? Was he even alive? My phone buzzed. It was my daughter, Emily. "Honey, are you still at Grandma's? You sound strange." "I'm just tired," I said, smiling without meaning to. "I had a feeling you shouldn't be alone tonight." Those words warmed something inside me. "I'll be home soon," I promised. That night I couldn't stop staring at the business card. Finally, my hand shaking, I dialed the number. It rang twice. Then an elderly man's voice, soft and careful. "Is this Hannah?" Every muscle in my body went still. "Yes." A long pause. "My name is Daniel. I believe your mother wanted us to meet someday. How did you know it was me?" I whispered. "Your father gave me this promise years ago," he said. "He told me if Eleanor never finds the courage, and Hannah ever comes looking for the truth, don't let her search alone. You knew all this time." I knew enough, but not everything. There were conversations your parents never shared with anyone. But I know enough to tell you where the story truly begins. Where? It doesn't begin in Ohio, it begins in Kentucky. The accident wasn't the first tragedy in this story, it was the second. A chill ran through me. "When can I see you?" "I was hoping you'd ask. I'll be waiting tomorrow morning." Before he hung up, he added one more sentence. "Bring your father's journal if you ever find one. Because the last page isn't missing. I've had it all these years." The man who kept waiting. I barely slept that night. Before sunrise, I was already dressed, the envelope, the photograph, and the clipping resting inside my old leather tote. The drive to Lancaster took just over an hour. It was strange. I had passed through that town countless times over the years, stopping for coffee, buying gas, never once realizing someone there had been carrying the story of my life. I kept glancing at the envelope on the passenger seat, as if it might disappear if I looked away for too long. Daniel lived in a small white house at the end of a quiet street, a wooden rocking chair moving gently on the porch. Before I could knock, the door opened. An elderly man stood there, his hair completely white, his eyes bright with something I couldn't quite name. "Hannah," he whispered, as if saying my name still surprised him after all these years. "I've wanted to hug you for more than 50 years. He said, "but I think that choice belongs to you." Without a word, I walked toward him. Inside, the house smelled of fresh coffee and old books. Every wall carried photographs, children, grandchildren, fishing trips, ordinary Christmas mornings. An ordinary life built slowly over decades. He led me to the kitchen table and poured 2 cups of coffee before either of us said very much at all. "I made an extra pot," he admitted, "in case you needed something to hold on to while we talked." I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and said nothing for a moment, grateful for something steady. On a small table sat a larger, better-preserved copy of the same photograph. "That's the last picture they ever took together," Daniel said quietly. "Your birth mother's name was Sarah Bennett." Sarah. For the first time, she was more than a face in a photograph. "Your father's name was Andrew." High school sweethearts. They didn't have much money, but they had enough love to fill 100 houses. They rented a little house 2 streets over from the hardware store. Sarah grew tomatoes and coffee cans on the back step because they couldn't afford a real garden yet. Andrew used to say he'd build her one someday, once things got easier. "Did things ever get easier?" I asked. Daniel's eyes softened with something between a smile and an old ache. "They were about to. That's the part that always broke my heart the most." We sat, and he told me the rest. Andrew wasn't supposed to be driving that night. He and Sarah had argued that afternoon. Nothing serious, the kind of thing married couples forget by dinner. They planned to leave the next morning, but he decided to drive after sunset instead. I've blamed that decision for years. The rain grew heavy. A truck crossed the center line. Sarah died instantly. Andrew was still alive when the ambulance arrived. He kept asking one question: "Is my little girl alive?" Nothing about himself, nothing about Sarah, only you. I felt tears forming. "Your mother's brother, Thomas, fought for custody," Daniel continued. "He loved you the moment he held you. He filed for guardianship immediately. But the hearing didn't go the way anyone expected. What happened? Daniel's eyes drifted somewhere past me, as if he were standing in that hallway all over again. The courthouse was crowded that morning. Lawyers, families, deputies, everyone moving in a dozen directions. Thomas arrived carrying a leather briefcase, the one that held every document proving who you were. Birth certificates, family records, letters, everything. Thomas never made it into the courtroom. He arrived, signed in, and 20 minutes later, he walked out without ever testifying. Why? Daniel's face turned solemn. For 50 years, nobody knew for certain. Your father spent half his life trying to find out. All he ever learned was that someone approached Thomas in the hallway that morning, and after that conversation, your uncle looked frightened, not angry, frightened, and simply left. I sat with that for a long moment. What was he like? I asked quietly. My Uncle Daniel smiled, a little sadly. Loud, stubborn, the kind of man who fixed things before you even finished asking for help. He used to say a promise wasn't worth much unless it cost you something. I turned that sentence over in my mind for a long time. He never came back for me. He tried, Daniel said gently. By the time the truth about that morning ever surfaced, it was already far too late to change anything. My father's journal. Daniel reached into a drawer and placed something in my hands, a worn leather journal, gold lettering nearly faded on the cover. Michael's journal, my father's name. I don't think anyone knew this existed, Daniel said. Not even Rebecca. I opened it. The first entry was dated, no year, just one sentence beneath it. Today a little girl took my hand, and I don't think my heart will ever be the same again. A tear rolled down my cheek before I reached the next page. He wasn't writing about Rebecca, he was writing about me. She smiled today for the first time since the accident. Tonight she finally slept without crying. She called me Daddy by mistake. I pretended not to notice. She asked me today if the stars follow her wherever she goes. I told her yes. I think she needed to believe someone always would. Eleanor is frightened of loving her too much. I understand why. But I think it's already too late for either of us. Then one entry made my hands begin to shake. If the court sends her away, I will understand. But I already know part of my heart will leave with her. All my life I had believed my father simply accepted me. Now I understood. He had loved me long before the law ever said he could. Further in, the entries turned darker, the pen strokes heavier. Your mother cried all morning. She says she cannot lose Hannah. I understand. Neither can I. But loving someone does not automatically make us right. If her uncle wins today, I will shake his hand and thank him for loving her enough to fight for her. Dad had questioned it. He had questioned whether they should even keep me, and still quietly for the rest of his life. He kept searching for what really happened that morning, writing down names, dates, court appointments, tiny details collected patiently over decades, not chasing a conspiracy, following the only thread that might finally explain his daughter's whole life. He never stopped looking, Daniel said softly. He believed the truth mattered more than his own peace. I thought of all the ordinary evenings I'd spent with my father, fixing fences, watching the news, saying almost nothing at all, never once suspecting that quietly. In some drawer or file box, he was still fighting a fight none of us knew existed. It made the ordinary evenings feel different somehow, heavier, and somehow more precious. My father's voice. Daniel disappeared into another room and returned holding an old cassette recorder, one small labeled tape resting beside it. Conversation with Michael. He recorded this only once, Daniel said. He told me if anything ever happens to me, I want Hannah to hear my own voice. My throat tightened. I hadn't heard my father's voice in 8 years. You don't have to listen today, Daniel said gently. It's waited 8 years. It can wait one more, if it needs to. I looked at the small recorder sitting between us on the table. Ordinary. Scratched along the edges. The kind of thing anyone else would have thrown away without a second thought. I took a slow breath. No, I've waited long enough. The machine clicked, then hummed. Then, unmistakably, my father's voice. Hello, sweetheart. My tears came without warning. For a second, I wasn't 53 years old. I was 10, running into the garage after school, listening to him whistle while he worked. If you're hearing this, then I wasn't able to tell you everything myself. I'm sorry, that was never what I wanted. There are many things parents hide from their children. Sometimes because we're ashamed, sometimes because we're afraid, and sometimes because we hope the truth will never become necessary. The day you took my hand, I stopped thinking about blood or court papers. You became my daughter long before any judge said you could. Your mother loved you, never doubt that. She simply believed love meant protecting you from the past. I believed love meant trusting you with it. We argued about that more than once, but I understood her fear. If you're angry with her, please remember, she spent every birthday wondering if it should have been celebrated by someone else. She punished herself more than anyone else ever could. His tone shifted. Be careful who you trust. If you've reached this recording, it means someone probably failed to keep a promise. I never proved everything I suspected, but I proved enough to know I wasn't imagining it. 3 weeks before I made this recording, someone entered our home while your mother and I were at church. Nothing valuable was taken, not the television, not her jewelry, not the cash in my dresser. Only one thing disappeared. The original guardianship file. I felt every muscle tighten. Whoever came into that house knew exactly where it was hidden. That frightened me more than the theft itself. I replaced the documents with copies and moved everything else somewhere safer. If you're hearing this, you already know where that somewhere is. The journal, I whispered. Good, you found it. I knew you would. There was a short silence, then his voice softened further. Hannah, there is one last thing. Everything you found so far, the hearing, the missing records, those are only pieces of it. I spent 20 years looking for the rest. If you're ready to know why, find the man who signed every document but never once appeared in court. His name is Judge Samuel Whitmore. Ask him one question. Why did he pretend not to recognize Andrew Bennett? The recording ended. The room went completely quiet. Daniel's face had lost all color. You knew about the judge, I whispered. He shook his head slowly. No, I always believed the judge had never met your family before. We sat in silence for a while after that. The tape had stopped, but my father's voice still seemed to hang in the room. I realized I had been holding my breath through most of it. Daniel reached over and gently switched off the recorder, as though giving my father the last word felt like the right thing to do. The safety deposit box. I searched the inside cover of the journal, the way Daniel remembered my father hiding small things. Near the bottom edge, I felt a slight bump beneath the paper lining. A tiny brass key slid into my palm, a faded tag stamped in black ink. Box 117. He planned all of this, I whispered. He hoped he was wrong, Daniel said, but he prepared in case he wasn't. My phone buzzed. Rebecca, again. This time I answered. Where are you? She asked. I stopped by Mom's house. Your car wasn't there, I hesitated. I'm visiting someone, a friend of Dad's. Silence. Then, quietly, Hannah. Are you hiding something from me? The question landed harder than she realized. Was I hiding something? Yes. Almost everything. But not because I wanted to. I'll tell you everything, I said softly. I just need one more day. She didn't argue. She simply sighed. You sound like Dad. He always asked for one more day whenever he thought he could still fix something. I smiled through tears she couldn't see. Less than an hour later, we stood inside the same community bank my parents had used my entire childhood. I placed a small brass key on the counter. I believe my late father had a safety deposit box, I said. The box is still active, the young banker said, surprised, after checking her screen. It's been prepaid for many years. I'll just need identification, she said kindly, and 10 minutes later we were escorted downstairs. Downstairs, in the quiet of the vault, rows of small metal boxes lined the walls, each one holding someone's careful secrets. The heavy door closed behind us, and for a moment it was only Daniel and me, and the hum of the ventilation overhead. I found number 117. My hands shook as the drawer slid open. Inside was a single leather folder and one sealed envelope. Across it, in my father's handwriting, read this before anything else. Hannah, if this letter reached you, then I was right. Someone eventually came searching for the truth. Before you open the folder, understand this. I never hated Judge Whitmore. I pitied him. Because by the end of his life, he was living with a choice he could never undo. The judge wasn't the person who started this. He was the last person who tried to stop it. Inside the folder were court transcripts, property records, old signatures, decades of my father's quiet collecting. And resting on top of it, a single photograph, only a few years old. 3 elderly men stood together outside a nursing home, smiling. Judge Whitmore, Daniel, my father, you knew him, I whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. Judge Whitmore spent the last years of his life trying to find you before your father died. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because your father asked me not to, Daniel said quietly. He wanted the truth to come from the man who owed it to you, not from a friend standing beside him. Beneath the photograph was a folded statement signed Samuel Whitmore. I have lived with this burden for most of my life. Andrew Bennett was my friend, one of the finest men I ever knew. When his case came before me, I asked to step aside. My request was denied over a scheduling conflict. I believed I could remain impartial. I was wrong. On the morning of the hearing, an old friend named Charles Harper came to my chambers. He asked me for a favor, nothing that seemed important at the time. He asked me to delay one piece of evidence he said would only complicate things unnecessarily. I agreed, more out of friendship than judgment. That decision left the hearing to proceed on incomplete information, and I have regretted it every day since. But the decision alone does not explain why Thomas Bennett never entered that courtroom. I did not learn the real reason until years later. Thomas received a telephone call moments before he was to testify. His mother, Rose, had collapsed from a stroke. He believed she was dying. He chose to go to her. I looked at Daniel, neither of us speaking. My uncle hadn't been threatened. He hadn't taken a bribe. He had simply chosen his dying mother over a hearing he assumed he could still win. She survived, Daniel said quietly, but Thomas didn't know that while he was driving, he never forgave himself. Neither did I. For 53 years, I had believed my life was shaped by favoritism. Then I believed it had been shaped by conspiracy. Now I understood. It had mostly been shaped by timing, cruel, unforgiving timing, and ordinary people making impossible choices. I have worn my robes for 40 years since that morning, and sat in judgment of countless people. None of them ever knew that the man sitting above them had once failed the simplest test of his own conscience. I am not asking Hannah to forgive me. I am only asking her to know that somewhere, for most of a lifetime, an old man carried her name like a stone in his pocket and never once put it down. The statement ended with one line meant for me. If Michael is reading this before Hannah, tell her something I never had the courage to say myself. Andrew Bennett would have been proud of the woman she became. So would Sarah. And so would Thomas. I folded it slowly. There wasn't some enormous conspiracy, I said. No, Daniel answered. There was fear and pride and a terrible piece of timing. The tragedy wasn't created by one villain. It was created by ordinary people making the worst decision of their lives on the same morning. At the bottom of the folder was one more note in my mother's handwriting addressed to Rebecca. I looked at Daniel. I think my sister deserves to know everything. I think your father would agree my sister's letter. Rebecca arrived just before sunset, took one look at my face, and set her purse on the floor. What happened? You've been crying for almost 2 days. She crossed the room and took both my hands in hers. Hannah, you're scaring me. I didn't answer right away. I just led her to the table where everything was already waiting. For the next hour, I told her all of it. The letter, the photograph, Andrew, Sarah, Thomas, Daniel, the judge, the box in the bank. She never interrupted. She simply listened, sometimes crying, sometimes staring silently at the table. When I finished, she whispered only one sentence. So, you're not Mom and Dad's biological daughter? No. She covered her mouth and began crying harder than I had ever seen. I'm so sorry. So terribly sorry. What are you apologizing for? I asked. Because I spent my whole life believing Mom loved me more. I thought I had done something right. I never realized she was protecting a secret. You were just a little girl, I said. So was I. We didn't create any of this. She reached for the letter with her name on it, traced the handwriting with her fingertips, and read it slowly. Near the end, she stopped, closed her eyes, and continued. When she finished, she simply held the paper against her chest. What did she say? I asked softly. Rebecca smiled through her tears. She apologized for making me carry a burden I never knew existed. Every time I treated Hannah differently, I prayed you would never notice. Because if you noticed, you would ask why. And I could never answer, neither of us spoke. Mom hadn't only hidden the truth from me. She had hidden it from Rebecca, too. There was something else, Rebecca said. She said she never wanted me to believe I had won. Rebecca laughed, broken and soft. I spent 50 years thinking I was the favorite. She wrote, there should never be winners inside a family. I reached across the table, taking her hand. We both lost, I whispered. We did. Do you think Mom knew how much this would cost us? Rebecca asked quietly. I think she knew exactly what it would cost, I said. I just don't think she knew how to pay it any other way. Rebecca nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. For a long time we simply sat together, letting the silence become peaceful instead of painful. Finally, Rebecca reached into her purse. I almost forgot, I found something too, in Dad's desk. I didn't think it mattered until today. She placed a small white envelope on the table, across the front, in Dad's handwriting. For my girls. If you're reading this together, then you finally know the truth. That means I've succeeded. Because my greatest fear was never that Hannah would learn where she came from. My greatest fear was that the truth would separate my daughters. Please don't let it. Family is built by love remembered, not by blood shared. Hannah, thank you for choosing us every day without ever knowing you had another choice. Rebecca, thank you for loving your sister without ever asking whether she was really your sister. You have always been my daughters. Nothing written on a birth certificate will ever change that. By the time I finished reading, neither of us was holding back tears anymore. Rebecca leaned her head against my shoulder. You know, I don't care what any paper says. You're still my little sister. I laughed through my tears. And you're still bossy. I've always been bossy. We both laughed, the first real laugh either of us had shared since Mom's funeral. The grief was still there. The questions were finally answered. But something inside both of us had quietly healed. The meaning of family. The cemetery was quiet that morning, a gentle breeze moving through the old maple trees. Rebecca walked beside me, neither of us feeling the need to speak. Some silences aren't empty. Some are full of understanding. We stopped first at Mom and Dad's grave, one shared headstone, just as they had shared nearly 50 years together. I placed a small bouquet of white lilies beside them. I was angry yesterday, Rebecca admitted. So was I. But today, I said, looking down at their names, I think I'm just grateful. They weren't perfect, Rebecca said. No, I smiled softly, they were wonderfully imperfect. I reached into my purse and took out my mother's letter, not to read it again, just to hold it. I used to think she chose you over me every single day, I whispered. I know, Rebecca said. I spent years believing that too, but now I think she was choosing fear, not favorites. Rebecca squeezed my shoulder. I think you're right. Then I turned toward the older section of the cemetery. You coming? She nodded immediately. I wouldn't let you go alone. Daniel had given us directions. 3 simple headstones stood side by side beneath a large oak tree. Sarah Bennett, Andrew Bennett, Rose Bennett. The grass was still damp from the morning. Somewhere behind us a bird called out twice, then went quiet. I knelt before Andrew and Sarah's graves. For a long moment I didn't know what to say. How do you introduce yourself to parents who never had the chance to watch you grow up? Finally the words came. Hi, my name is Hannah. I guess you already knew that. A tiny laugh escaped me and then the tears returned. I want you to know I had a good life. I was loved. My father taught me honesty. My mother taught me strength. My sister taught me loyalty. I wasn't alone. I never really was. The wind moved gently through the trees, almost like an answer. I placed the old family photograph against their headstone, just for a moment, long enough for everyone in the picture to be together again. I wish they could have met you, Rebecca whispered. I think they did, I said, pointing toward my heart. They've been with me my whole life. They just had a different way of loving me. Rebecca slipped her hand into mine, the way she had when we were girls crossing a busy street, and for once, neither of us needed to say anything more. Before we left, I unfolded Dad's note one last time. Family is built by love remembered, not by blood shared. For the first time, those words didn't feel like comfort. They felt like truth. As we walked back toward the car, Rebecca slipped her arm through mine, exactly the way she used to when we were teenagers. If Mom were standing here, she said, she'd probably tell us we're taking too long, I laughed. And Dad would tell her to let us have 5 more minutes, we both laughed. I miss them, she said. So do I. But missing someone, I said, is a beautiful price to pay for having loved them. Together, we walked toward the car, not carrying secrets anymore, not carrying guilt, only memories, the kind that grow gentler with time. I looked back one final time. 4 graves, 2 families, 1 life. For 53 years, I believed I had to choose between where I came from and where I belonged. I was wrong. Because in the end, I didn't have 1 family, I had 2. One gave me life. The other taught me how to live. I used to think family was something you were simply born into. Now I understand it's something you're chosen for, over and over by people who never had to stay. And I finally understood something my father had known from the very beginning. The people who love you, the people who stay, the people who choose you again and again, they are your family, no matter what any piece of paper says. Thank you for spending this evening with me at Lantern House. If this story touched you, stay a while. There are many more by the fire.